morning.
Good morning.
We're in the summer series we've been exploring this book by Amy Jill Levine, Signs and Wonders, A Beginner's Guide to the Miracles of Jesus. And I follow her discussion, but then I also bring out points of contrast. And so what we're going to, the sermon, which was just beautiful, was based on the Matthew text, but we're going to look at Matthew and Mark. So I entitled this An Imploring Father, a Bleeding Woman, a Girl at the Point of Death, Jesus Meets Human Need. That's all in our presentation. Here's two opening prayers for us, so let us pray in unison. You delight, let's offer you to God. And from the dust you lovingly fashioned, embodied life in your good creation. Breathe into us again wisdom and understanding, that our reading and discussion today may lead us to see and serve others for the sake of Jesus, whom we worship as your word made flesh. Lord, make us, let's continue now. Lord, make us aware of those who are in need, in body, soul, or spirit, and make us agents of your healing, comforting presence. Hold them and us in your loving embrace as we continue this journey of life. O gracious God, O creator of all, O triune one, we submit ourselves and our hearts to you, and we ask that your good spirit would be amongst us as we learn in community. So we put ourselves in your presence and ask for your guidance in Christ's name. Amen. Amen. So we're going to be exploring the scripture, and we're going to be looking at two miracles that follow closely together. Jesus heals a woman subject to bleeding for 12 years. That's in Matthew 9:20 to 22, Mark 5:24 to 34, and Luke 8:43 to 48. We're going to be looking at, and then we have Jesus raises Jairus' daughter, and that's in Matthew 9:18 to 19 and 23 to 26. And then it's in Mark 5:22 to 24 and 35 to 43. And it's in Luke 8:49 to 56. So we have it in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And this presentation is focusing on the Matthew text and the one in Mark. And the location for all of these passages is Capernaum. So this is how it's going to proceed. First, we're going to explore the scripture. We're going to focus on Matthew's text, and then we're going to look at Matthew's narrative. Then we're going to talk about, the second part is the theme of approaching Jesus. Then part 3 is issues and questions. Now, in issues and questions, Amy Jill Levine raises some questions, and scholarship has some questions about the passage. We'll mention that. But what we want to do is we want to continue focusing on what's the main thing to keep in mind. So we're going to talk about the theme of courage. This text says, take heart. That's the idea, to have inner courage. And then Mark's perspective, we're going to read that text. And then at the end, we're going to consider points of focus, like seeking the care of our bodies, trusting God in times of disorientation, about approaching Jesus and being approachable, and a closing prayer. So when we're together, as you know, we get to talking, and there's so many different points brought up. But at the end, there's going to be some simple takeaways for us. And as your teacher, I would like you to have some simple points that you can sort of take, that we can take with us and reflect on. So we're going to consider our narrative in the focus text of Matthew 9:18 to 26 and Mark 5:1 to 24. The Matthew text is the shortest of the two, and the Mark text has more detail and draws out a contrast between Jesus' delay in getting to Jairus' house. Levine points out that the Gospel of Mark uses a narrative technique whereby one account is sandwiched within another account, and she remarks, like pastrami on rye or peanut butter and banana between two pieces of bread, you have one narrative sandwiched within a larger one. So we will explore Matthew's narrative and then later in our session that of Mark. So we have Matthew 18 to 26, and we're going to have three readers. And I want to point out that Amy Jo Levin is quoting from the Revised Standard Version. So I often use the New Revised Standard Version. A little bit differences in the two versions, but we'll go with Amy's Revised Standard Version. So can I have reader 1, reader 2, and reader 3 volunteers? Okay, you can be reader 1. Okay. And then we want a reader 2. Okay, and reader 3? Do I see a third hand looking for an option there? Okay, back there we'll go. Okay, all right, reader 1.
While Jesus was saying these things to them, suddenly a leader came in and knelt before him, saying, "My daughter has just died, but come and lay your hand on her and she will live." And Jesus got up and followed him with his disciples.
Reader 2. Yeah.
Then suddenly a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years came up behind him and touched the fringe of his cloak. So she had said to herself, "If I only touch his cloak, I will be made well." Jesus turned and seeing her, he said, "Take heart, my daughter, your faith has made you well." And instantly the woman was made well.
Reader 3.
When Jesus came to the leader's house and saw the flute players and the crowd making a commotion, he said, "Go away, for the girl is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. But when the crowd had been put outside, he went in and took her by the hand, and the girl got up. And the report of this spread throughout that district.
I thank the readers, and from hearing it, we can sense the movement in the text itself. So now we're going to go to part 2 about approaching Jesus. The Matthew text refers to the man as a leader. The Greek word is archon, and the idea for that word is ruler. Some of the versions say ruler of the synagogue. So the phrase "of the synagogue" is not in the Greek, but some say of the synagogue. So he's a person who has, in any event, in the Matthew text, he's a person who has some authority. And Mark tells us his name is Jairus, but Matthew has him nameless. I found out that Luke also says Jairus, but Matthew doesn't say his name. So he kneels before Jesus. How does this kneeling indicate how he perceives his relationship to Jesus? He's a ruler of the synagogue, or some kind of ruler, an archon, and he's on his knees. What does this indicate, possibly? Respect. Other ideas?
He's coming with requests, so he's looking up.
Yeah,
It's no more than respect. I mean, he thinks this person
it's a
can do
child.
that.
Yeah. So utter respect. And yet he's a person of authority. So Levine remarks, no matter how much political authority or economic clout we have, there are some things that we cannot do. Admitting our inability to do something on our own is a good first step. Asking for help is a good second step. And making sure that we are heard is a third step. So I want us to consider the role of a parental advocate, because he's the parent and he has to come and speak to have the need of his child met. Now, as an official, he could send emissaries or some group to say, come to his house, but he goes himself. As Ernie said, he falls on his knees. He's desperate. And he's seeking treatment from anyone who might be able to help. But particularly Jesus, because Jesus has this reputation. So can you think of an incident in your life in which you had to advocate for another? A time in your life where you had to speak out for somebody else. After I wrote this question, I had difficulty thinking about myself. Have I ever been an advocate for someone? And the answer is not in a legal sense. But I did have situations where I was teaching in the public schools back in my former life. And I had a little girl come to me and tell me that she had had an uncle that had come down to visit her. I was teaching in Texas at the time. And she said she had an uncle came down to visit the family from Texas. And she indicated that she had, I think, a sexual relationship with him. And I'm like, oh. So I went and talked to my principal. But one of the problems there, it was considered, if we had kind of taken a legal step, it would have been, this is back in the day, it would have been considered, I think, heresy, not firsthand information. But the little girl had said this to me, and I believe that that's what she meant. And sometimes those of us, how many of you have been teachers? Raise your hand. Yeah, there's teachers in the room. You'll know what I'm talking about. Sometimes you know, I see people nodding, they get this. We sense something's going on. I also sensed at a time once where I thought that, I don't know this is the fact, but I highly suspected that this little boy who was acting out, he was a product of a divorced home. And I sensed that the mother kind of had like almost a smother love, like where's the boundary there? I mean, I'm not saying she was sexually abusing him, but there were all kinds of ways that he was acting out. I don't know that for a fact, but when we work in these situations and we see these things time and time again, so I can't say that I actually advocated, but if you think about it, when you in your workplace or when you meet people, you can sometimes sense and know. But A.J. Levine notes that Jesus had been curing every disease and sickness among the people. She quoted Matthew 4:23, and that his fame had spread throughout all Syria. So the Father has heard Jesus's reputation for healing, and would be logical for him to try to find help for his daughter. But he comes in person and on his knees before Jesus, and Jesus begins to follow the leader to his home. Now, Mark's perspective is that Mark tells us that this leader is a synagogue ruler named Jairus. And Mark 5:22 reads, then one of the leaders of the synagogue named Jairus came, and when he saw him, fell at his feet, and Matthew says kneeling, but fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly, my little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be well and live. So he went with him. So Mark says went with him, but Luke said he followed him. And in Matthew, as I said, Jesus follows the synagogue leader. And Levin remarks that this is striking because usually people follow Jesus, but in this case, Jesus was following the leader. But Mark simply says he went with him. So there's a lot of detail in these texts. So it's clear that this father strongly advocates for his little girl who is at the point of death. And in Mark, the interruption of the woman with an issue of blood is perceived by Jairus as a costly delay. And so Mark draws that out a lot. So the woman interrupts. So could someone read here Matthew 5:27-28? Can I have a reader? Ernie, go ahead.
She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, if I but touch his clothes, I will be made well.
She wants to.
Agree, group?
Yeah, go ahead and keep reading. Literally, I shall be saved. And this I will be made well in the Greek is literally I will be saved. And the Greek root word means, it can mean saved, healed, delivered. But she wants to be saved from her physical condition. So this is a little geeky stuff, but sozo is the Greek verb. It means it's translated to save, but it has a range of meaning determined by the context. So it can mean salvation in terms of deliverance from danger, suffering, sickness. In other places in the New Testament, it means spiritual salvation. It can mean deliverance from bondage of sin. It can also refer to future deliverance, but in this context, it probably has meaning A, deliverance from suffering, what she's experiencing. She's looking to be delivered from it. So we're still thinking about approaching Jesus, and this woman has a bleeding condition. Levine points out that the woman did not approach Jesus the same way the Father did. She did not come up to Jesus and ask for healing. She comes behind him and touches his garment. Why does she not go up to Jesus directly? Why do you think?
She was a woman, that would be out.
As a woman, to be out of place. Another idea.
I was gonna say
Same
the same
thing. Now, what kind of condition does she have?
She's unclean,
She's what?
unclean.
Maybe unclean. She's bleeding for sure.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
mean,
that would be considered unclean in those days. So the thing is, and so another thing we don't know. I'm going to have information on the next slide. I don't think we know her exact condition, but she's some kind of bleeding, hemorrhaging, and that means a lot of bleeding. And she might have been considered unclean, but she's going up to touch him anyhow. So there's an
she
issue here.
touches
Yeah.
his clothes, not him. She only
Clothes,
touches his
Right,
clothes.
cloak, exactly. But he feels it coming out, yeah. So she's approaching Jesus, and there's issues of social standing. So the man is a leader in a synagogue, and he has some standing in his community. But as we said, the woman is probably, in comparison to him, a lower social standing. So the man kneels before Jesus, and Jesus follows him, and the woman bends down to touch Jesus's garment, and she follows him to do so. Both are desperate, and the man for his daughter, and the woman to be released from her ongoing condition. One is of a higher standing, but both can approach the master in time of need. So the issue for scholarship, and it's already been brought up here, is this woman considered impure? Levine, this is Levine's opinion. She did not think that the woman violated the purity laws in touching Jesus because neither Jesus nor the woman were in the temple. And she insists that neither Jesus nor the women were violating the law. Now, I'm going to bring out further information. Luke 15, verse 18 following states, when a woman has a discharge of blood that is the regular discharge from her body, she shall be in her impurity for 7 days, and that which she lies on is impure. And if after 8 days she is not bleeding, she shall take 2 turtle doves and 2 young pigeons and bring them to the priest to the entrance of the tent of meeting. So here the entrance was not the temple, but an earlier structure called the tent of meeting in the wilderness. Now, my question that came up when I was talking to somebody about this is, Jesus touched lepers. So this is like in the ivory tower, they're talking about this, but in Luke 15:25 qualifies that if there's blood beyond the time of the 7 days or some different time coming not during the regular expected 7 days, she has to wait 7 days until the bleeding stopped and then bathe and take an offering to the priest at the tent of meeting. Now, in Leviticus, people were concerned in those days, because they're in the wilderness, and the presence of Yahweh was with the company that was going through the wilderness. So they didn't want anything that would signify death or seem like death. So they were really watching out to not have any kind of discharge in the house, and they didn't want anything unclean around because they didn't want anything that would signify death, jeopardizing their the presence of Yahweh with them. That was the thinking at the time. But see, the woman in the gospel passage has hemorrhages. So there's just more questions and issues because we don't know if this woman is Gentile or Jewish. And Levine thinks that the purity laws do not apply to Gentiles. But the question is, this woman is held, here's the question, is this woman held in lower esteem by the community because she has a discharge of blood, which is seemingly ongoing? See, and this has been, some of you think yes, you know, that possibly, yeah, she could have a lower esteem within the community structure because of whatever condition she has.
Susan's sick and home.
Okay, yeah,
I got a couple questions about it.
sure.
First of all, in terms of her having, let's say she's having her period or it's an extraordinary incident of bleeding or whatever. Orthodox Jews today, males do not sleep with their wives while they're having their periods.
Yes.
This even continues to today. The second thing is Jairus, or this leader in the temple who shows ultimate respect to Jesus and kneels even before him. It is recognized many times in the Old Testament, New Testament, that Jesus is a Rebbe or a rabbi. So I don't know if there's a hierarchy of rabbis, you know, within the temple, but to me, it's not that unusual that Jairus would have showed him this respect because he is thought as a rabbi or a teacher.
Yes,
Even
yes.
then.
He made,
So,
those are good points. Yes,
so there's a lot going on here, but
a lot going on here.
and I think you kind of also have to look at it in the context of those times.
Oh,
And
yes,
as you
yes,
said,
yes.
the social structure and how the relationships work.
Any other comments from people on Zoom? Thank you, Nick. Well, it also is possible that we just don't have enough information to know exactly what her condition is, but we're not far afield to think that socially she may be in a lesser position than Jairus. And Nick brought out the point that in relation to Jesus, Jairus would sense some authority.
Capernaum would have been a very small town, probably a few hundred people at most. And if someone's chronically ill, which this woman is, everyone
They're going to
knows
know
their
it.
business.
Yes, yes, you're going to know who's who. Yeah. So Levine admits that the woman may have been regarded as impure, and she asked rhetorically, can this woman go out in public? Levine insists that Jesus is not affirming her violation, and neither is he dismissing the purity laws. That was her opinion. But the basic point is Jesus receives this woman who went the distance to touch him, and as it's been qualified, she touched the cloak. So then what we have to think about is that Jesus meets us. And the first section is called courage. Could I have someone read Levine's translation here of Matthew 9:22, another reader? You read for us, 9:22?
Looking at
Yeah,
me?
go ahead.
Okay. And Jesus, turning and seeing her, said, "Be courageous, confident, daughter. Your faith has saved you." And the woman was saved at that hour.
Be courageous, or take courage, or other versions say take heart. And Levine calls attention to the word to the disciples in Matthew. She compares this with the word to the disciples in Matthew 14:27. When the disciples see Jesus walking on the water, Jesus tells them, have courage. Jesus says, have courage, be confident. It is I, do not be afraid. Courage. Now, I have some questions here for your reflection, and we're going to get into groups again. Was there a time when you needed courage, and can you recall an incident where you sensed like you maybe prayed about it and received a sense of courage or inner confidence, taking heart? Is there a certain way to approach Jesus? The woman and the man had different approaches. And then how can we have confidence to approach Jesus? So these are types of questions. So I want you to get in groups of 4 or 5 and talk together about those 3 questions. And then I'll bring the group into focus. And then those of you who are on Zoom, I want you to be thinking about the 3 questions. I want you to be thinking about the 3 questions, and then we'll also ask you your responses afterwards. So let's gather in groups.
I saw only one name on my left, so I didn't write the name. Everybody probably up to the same. Gabrielle. Owen. I'm sorry, Joanna. Yeah. You want me to turn this one over?
God give you courage.
What came to me was, when I was little, I was always the one. And when I grew up, I didn't all night, and I had this dream of this walk coming down. And so I wore a red.
Probably tried to solve
But for some reason, you're not.
recognize
And I just decided that I would ask folks to take me out somewhere and pass the grade.
in terms of the context of the time, I can't
It always
imagine that. Look how we all are in everyday lives. First thought all the time, Jesus, all those problems.
because they made people feel. What I was saying, they made me feel. So I grew up.
But I didn't just in college.
Anyway, so when
I had 8 origins. Very well. God's the best one.
And nothing
You like the back up now. It's on yours.
Did a beautiful job.
That I was terrified of.
I woke up. It's all right.
I was certain things all the time. I went there and I realized I cried.
Coming down.
Maybe he's going.
And I could hear these.
Out of this very calm area, and all of a sudden, they end with
Big animal were laying.
there were 2 who were there. Yes,
And I
and
just
when I'm like,
said,
and
then when I woke up,
what I laid there is, we're out here, we're helpless. And I prayed so hard.
going, he said,
Eventually, the
you
word
approach
came
me.
out, and finished. You know exactly what I felt like. But this is like, wake up, we're gonna drown. Because it came out of nowhere. And I thought, this is just trying to show me something, teach me something, because I'll never forget that feeling of how scared they were.
Really?
I mean, really hard. What else is there but to pray? Really hard.
I don't know. I hated people that don't have the faith. Sometimes you had to. I think I was just, well, what's the worst? You know, they're if I don't get through this without, flawlessly, I'm sure I'll do okay.
It always
You kind of have to just let it go.
strikes me,
Say, this will be over at some point, you know.
we know
That
that God reached out
during
to
this time, Phil went out
I
to
mean,
sell
there wasn't anything
Are
apparently.
coming to us really.
There were other things.
what they needed to live for
God all
one
have
day.
his
Being a
It wasn't much,
or something.
but then there are others.
human
I don't
life.
know, just have to think, well, this is what the way things go in life.
To me, at least.
And Clint. Well, yeah. Yeah, well, it did. I graduated. No, I know I know I mean, I went ahead and did it. I just didn't like feeling it.
Sure, what they go
Other
through.
classmates probably had the same feelings when they had to come and speak. I just feel like I couldn't catch a good math and all that. But then, since now I have spoken to your church and just because I knew the person very well. And I was comfortable.
Yeah.
Where was the pump?
Okay.
The last question, the middle question.
I haven't much to say.
I didn't go with him, I went with him. He said the other doctors.
But I
No question. Just remember anybody.
Yes.
We're not in a situation where we're.
Okay.
physically reaching out.
Yeah.
And he was in a ship. But I would normally go to that country.
I mean, the one
At the Lord or
Sometimes I have to watch out what I throw out in the universe. It's great.
respecting their seeing. And he said, that's why why are they there? Then they it's like you're not a deity.
Yeah.
You don't have
I need help.
ceremony.
It's like.
How do you?
This is very.
Yes. But just to go.
Stories because smile.
Satisfied with God, and that is intermediate.
Yeah.
What you know.
We should go on to that second one. Is there a way
But I've done something extraordinary in that person's world.
There's no certain place.
Yeah.
Whatever you need.
You don't need to be in the church.
And over there, I got one girl, I started with the nail polish and there, and I realized it wasn't the nail polish, somebody, nobody in their life has a chance sometimes.
Amazing to watch the birds, how they respond. Beating humidity, I think that days ago, so awful. The meadow, I don't know, was just quiet. They were down, just try to, and all that they say today, they were, I'll tell you.
Can we would contact when you.
I'm gonna call you back now.
They had to go to the temple. Way of time. This church had probably been Catholic or something.
Okay.
But
Sue wants us to come back.
Yeah. Hey, well, I think we're good.
Yes.
I think she wants to.
She's trying to get.
I could hear us.
Very symbolic.
Let me move up just.
This was a time for you to share your personal stories and your connections. Sometimes one can share in a small group a little bit more readily than in a larger group. I do want to ask those of you on Zoom, can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you share with the group anything that you were thinking?
I'll start.
Okay.
I at one time in my life went through severe financial problems. I won't go into detail, but they were, just trust me, they were severe. And I really felt the only way out was to get God's help. So believing that I'm his son, like he refers to the woman as his daughter, I went to him as my father and said, I've got a real problem. I need help. I need guidance. I need advice. And I did it two ways, one through prayer and the other through conversation. And obviously there were answers.
Thank you, Nick. Anyone, how about Carolyn or Susan or Sharon or David and Nancy? Do you have something you want to share with the group?
They're hiding.
Yes? Okay, I thought I heard somebody saying something. But also, yes, Carolyn, yes.
Yeah, there was a time in my life when I was challenged by God to do something that I really didn't want to do. And I prayed about it. And I told him, I said, Lord, I don't want to do this. And he kept coming back to me and telling me that I should do it. So I did. And it turned out to be absolutely the right thing to do, because I befriended someone who had no one and nursed that person through an illness. And that person was not necessarily a believer. And shortly before she died, she said to me, you always worried about what was what. And God has sustained me even this day because of that. So it's not easy. It takes courage. It takes perseverance, but it's the right thing to do, to listen to him.
And also, yes, I hear you saying also, I don't mean to interrupt, but I hear you saying that this decision that you made before God, this had implications for your life. It was not just the decision for the moment or the decision for that year, but a decision that had implications over time.
It lasted 50 years.
Oh, my goodness. Thank you, Carolyn. Anyone else you want to share from the Zoom? I shared with one group, and I won't go into a lot of detail, but I had an ongoing physical condition, and I prayed about it, and then I ended up talking to my aunt Fomi, whom I don't hear from very often, and this was in California, and she specifically asked me, how is your physical health? And so I told her what I was struggling with, and she said, you need to see Dr. So-and-so. This is his address. And this guy was the high specialist in that area. And I went into him, and it took quite a bit of money in those days. And I had, this was fee for a 2-hour consultation, but he couldn't talk with me all afternoon. I had Friday blocked off. Can you imagine a doctor taking Friday afternoon just to talk to you? So this is what happened. And he explained to me further about my condition. He told me what kind of tipped it over the top. He had a suggestion for me and encouraged me. And then what happened is I had to make a difficult decision about a surgery. But what happened was that I had the confidence after that to know that I was going in the correct direction. So that was just amazing. But I needed the specialist word in order to have the inner courage to move ahead.
Is that a God thing that he had that Friday locked off?
Yeah.
Well, he blocks off, such a professional, he blocks off on a regular basis. Okay, I'll just say this much, the man has high-end clients. Yeah, so anyhow, I was just blown away. So I saw a message on a Christian sweatshirt and it said, God's got this. And the one who invites us to take courage may call us to step out of that boat. Or we may have to step out, maybe we're in a social situation where we're not the top peg in the social, sometimes we have to advocate for another. Sometimes if we do have a position, maybe we have to humble ourselves to come to another. There's a mix here, but the point is that God's got this, so that gives us courage. Yes, Ernie?
One of the points we raised, I think is very important, the sort of triggered by your second question. And that's the reinforcement of the idea that we can approach Christ directly. We do not need to go through a priest. We don't have to be in the church. We don't, we can be anywhere, anytime, because both of these stories are very interpersonal.
They are very
no
interpersonal.
institutional involved
No,
between
not at all.
them. They're
Excellent
personal.
observation.
And I think that's something we all need to keep reminding ourselves, that we are welcome to approach Jesus directly.
And Leah did something interesting in the sermon. Her title was Reaching Jesus. I'm talking about approaching Jesus, and she talked about reaching Jesus. But at the end, she said, well, Jesus, God's all around. God's available.
Yeah,
Like I just said something out of the blue. Yeah.
he's reached out first.
Exactly. And so there aren't any rules about how to approach Jesus, but if we do approach God, God is there. So now we're going to have Mark's perspective, and we're going to have different people read. And I need several readers. I think I need 6 readers. So we want a reader 1, volunteer? Okay, thank you. Why don't you read 1?
Then one of the leaders of the synagogue named Jairus came, and when he saw him, fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." So he went with
Someone to be reader 2? Go ahead.
And a large crowd followed him and
Could read it a little louder.
And a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse.
Reader 3. Go ahead.
She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she had been healed of her disease.
Reader 4.
Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you? How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease.
Reader 5.
While he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James.
Reader 6.
When they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, there was a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he had entered, he said to them, "Why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." Then they laughed at him.
And then he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. And he took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the little girl got up and began to walk about. And she was 12 years of age. And at this they were overcome with amazement. And he strictly ordered them that no one should know this. And he told them to give her something to eat. Now, there's a lot of questions about this passage, and there's no small debate about the state of the little girl. And Levine discusses this. There's no small discussion among scholars about the state of this little girl. Matthew says the girl is dead. Mark has her not dead, but sleeping. Levine wants readers to understand the child may be right up to the point of death and thus may be facing death. I want to bring to your attention that in the Old Testament, those who are approaching death, you see this in the Psalms and in the other literature, that those approaching death are considered as good as dead. And also, those who are severely ill and suffering, and they saw death kind of like okay, we have hospice, right?
Yeah.
There's suffering, and then there's death. It's sort of a continuum, and there's a point where one is dead, but the suffering leading up to death for them was considered death. So her tentative conclusion is that the child is in the face of death. Isn't that interesting? So she notes that all sorts of explanations have been put forward. One explanation is she's in a coma. She's in a catatonic state, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of explanations. But Levine opines that even if the child is right up to the point of death, this does not make the situation anything less than a miracle.
No.
Jesus takes her hand and says, "Talitha cum," and this is Aramaic language for "little girl, arise." And this girl gets up and walks around. So all of this is a lot of information, but we need to think about some focus points for ourselves. And one focus point that Levin brings up in her writing is that this woman is demonstrating, first she said that this woman is demonstrating great courage, and I do agree that she's demonstrated great courage and faith in the faith that she has in the face of the Master. And Matthew has Jesus proclaim that her faith has made her well. And Mark includes Jesus experiencing power going out from him when the woman touches his cloak, and faith and deep trust is involved. So this woman has been suffering, Matthew 9:20 tells us, from hemorrhages for 12 years. So it's some type of extensive bleeding. She has endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather got worse. And the opinion here is this woman goes to great lengths to find the healing she needs for her body, but it has been to no avail. Levine provides a starter list of areas that demand attention and care for women's bodies. So she says that we need to seek more information about cancer prevention and treatment for women. There's areas about nutritional deficiencies that women might have, reproductive health, domestic abuse, mental health issues, issues about hypersexualized images of women in our culture and the media. But I make the observation that today there are many women in the world that cannot advocate for themselves. Some women can go the distance, but not all women can. And this is very true in many parts of the world. So in the case of Jairus, it seems as if the attention of the woman was interfering with the urgent need to bring his daughter from death to life. Wait a minute, what are you doing? She's had it for 12 years. Why don't, can she wait an hour longer? That's where this comes from.
Yeah.
So I want you to think about times, this is a private question, and think about times where it seemed as if God was late or delayed in responding to you or to a loved one. We can ask ourselves, what should be our orientation to God in this time? But life has periods of disorientation. Sometimes we feel oriented. Sometimes we feel disoriented. Sometimes we can sense ourselves coming out of a period of disorientation and experiencing some reorientation. But sometimes we don't have a resolution. It's all what I'm talking about. So not all, this is life. It's all of us are old enough to know it's not always neat and tidy, but we are going to trust in the one who can do exceedingly abundantly above all we can ask or think. And so I think the saying on the sweatshirts, not just glib, God's got this, but this reflection is ongoing. It's not like, oh, well, God's got this and you're denying that you have a physical condition. But God does have our whole world in God's hands. So our reflection will continue to be ongoing, and we want God to continue to lead us and to guide us. So this is reflection about trusting God in times of disorientation. Now, there's also a reflection we can have about approaching Jesus and being approachable. There are different ways to approach Jesus. The man comes directly. The woman of a different status approaches Jesus from behind, but both are received by Jesus. Both approach Jesus because they are desperate. And the man is pleading for his daughter who is at the point of death, and the woman has an ongoing bleeding condition. So we can come to Jesus on behalf of another, like the father was coming on behalf of the daughter, or we can come to Jesus on behalf of ourselves. Jesus cares about all sorts of people, men, women, and children, and cares about people from different nations, different ethnicities, different religions, different walks of life. And Jesus, God allows us to approach him, but the triune God also approaches us. In short, the divine one is approachable. And the triune God now calls us in Christ to be sensitive to those who approach us. What are their needs? What is God asking us to do? Simple takeaway, things to think about. Who is approaching you? We can also ask as a community, who is approaching us? But personally, individually, and corporately, we can ask, who is approaching you? Who comes to you in need? Who may need a touch? How can we be agents of God's healing, comforting presence? This is the takeaway. Let us approach God with our needs and the needs of others. And so I just thank you for this time. I thank you for your reflection. We're actually just a little bit early here, but basically I wanted to share with you the two texts, their similarities and differences, to see that there are issues, but also see that there's a profound way that God is very much in touch with our lives. And Christ didn't experience every single suffering in his lifetime. He didn't experience some of the sufferings that women experience, but he experienced human suffering. And so the Christian God is aware of suffering, suffered God's self. This God knows what it means to be human. This God, from the Christian perspective, went the distance for us. This God is a God not of death, but of life. But then we have the mystery that we as humans, we will die, but our whole being, individually and corporately, is in God's hands. Thank you.
Thank you. Hang on 1 second, Jim. Hey, Susan,
Yes,
I have a question or comment.
yes.
The story about the girl and whether she's sleeping or near death or dead, to me raises an interesting question, because I kind of think she was dead, and what Jesus is kind of doing is giving us a preview of his own resurrection. And if he's giving us, a view of his own resurrection, the question it raises for me, and I've kind of been unsure of this, does Levine believe that Jesus was really resurrected? Because there are some Jews, and there was a book written years ago called The Passover Plot, who believed that Jesus was given chemicals so he would appear to be dead. And then he actually wasn't really resurrected. He was only under the influence of these drugs at the time. So there are Jews who definitely have a problem with the whole concept of Jesus being resurrected. And I'm wondering where Levine stands. Do you have any idea?
Well, I don't hear her saying, so far in the chapters I've read so far, I've not heard her say that, she has not made an affirmation of resurrection. She believes in God. And I think that about Jesus being God in the flesh, which is a necessary belief to also believe in the Christian concept of the resurrection, it's like she goes right up to touch the hem of the garment. And, I don't know if she actually touches the hem of the garment. If you read that, I see some of you nodding that have read her. It's like, and then I want to say that if you have further questions or comments, I'm going to ask you to come to me, because I want to be sure to let you guys out. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.